Hey, welcome back to the show. Today we're talking about immigration, ICE, and what the law actually says about your rights. ICE counts on fear and confusion to push past legal limits. My guest today, who is a PhD candidate in human rights, is here to break down what's legal, what isn't, what we need to know, and how to protect yourself and your community. So let's get into it. Carlos, welcome to the show. I want first just take a moment to introduce yourself. Tell folks you have an impressive background, and I'm excited for me and everybody else to learn from you. So, can you tell us more about your background and your
Yeah, of
who
course.
you are?
Yeah, thank you for having me. My name is Carlos Alberto. I also go by Chadley. I'm currently a PhD candidate at the University of Washington, and I study basically human rights as well as migrant rights and the different mechanisms that the United States uses within its immigration governance structures. I also work pretty exclusively on international law and using international law to advocate for release mechanisms in the domestic territory. So, with that comes engagements with the UN system, with the Inter American Commission system, essentially kind of to advocate for and create arguments for the release of individuals from US detention systems.
Thank you for sharing. Thank you. I've been so excited to just sit with you and learn from you. This is a topic that's been coming up a lot in the news, and we hear it all over social media. And I think it's really important for us to just get the right information. So, because knowledge is power, and it's what empowers us to make change. It's what empowers us to think critically about what's happening. And I'm excited for you to share your wisdom with us. So, one of the things I'd like to ask you first is just tell me a little bit more about what first pulled you into human rights work? What's your connection to this work?
Yeah, I think immigration has become such a big politicized topic. I think in the last year and a half, with the second Trump administration. But I think for me, it's always kind of been an issue surrounding my life. I grew up undocumented in the United States when I first migrated to Arizona, and if you know a little bit about Arizona history, I migrated during the time of SB 1070. So essentially, it's was the time of Arizona history where a sheriff named Joe Arpaio was essentially conducting unconstitutional stops and searches of individuals who he thought were undocumented, right? And not even to talk about the gravity of the unconstitutionality of these stops, right? But I really migrated at a time where my family and I were not allowed to speak about our status because it might have meant family separation, right? Me and all my friends were afraid of, coming home one day and our parents kind of being gone because they were taken by immigration enforcement. And at the same time, the TV programs, especially the Spanish language programs at the time in Telemundo, Univision, were kind of full of images of individuals in camps because essentially Joe Arpaio was holding people in makeshift tent camps in the Arizona summer heat. So that, along with those images, and I think just kind of the uncertainty around my own immigration status and the status of my family members, and just the whole situation in Arizona, kind of really galvanized me towards thinking about human rights and then the protection of migrants as well. Because in 2010, the whole country kind of began boycotting Arizona because the images that were coming out of the state were really, really horrifying. And I think for the people that lived there, uh, especially for my generation and the generation that came right after that, it really propelled a lot of people to start working on immigration and campaign for the protection of immigrants.
Thank you for sharing. Thank you. So when you think about, and I appreciate you sharing that because there's obviously a personal aspect to this, and you are you've had you've had three bachelor's degrees, and now you're on your PhD. You're about to close it out. So, doctor, you do
Yeah.
doctor too. So this is obviously personal. y- It's embedded into your work. What's been the most emotionally difficult thing that you have learned during your PhD program?
Yeah, and I think I've come to a point, I think, in my life where not a lot of things within the immigration sector kind of surprise me. Especially, growing up in Arizona, where I would see everything that Joe Arpaio would be doing, and then immediately after my undergraduate degrees, I began working for a pro bono asylum law firm where we were doing visitations to kind of be able to argue for avenues of relief for individuals who are kind of fleeing uh, trauma from like their home countries or even torture. So not a lot of things surprise me anymore, unfortunately. But I think throughout my PhD, I was able to continue with my legal visitations at the Northwest Detention Center, and I think just the conditions across detention, I think, have been pretty horrifying. And one of the things that I think not only surprised me the most, but makes me the most sad, right, is the length of detention of some of the people that I've been able to visit and who I count as clients and later friends. For example, one individual who I used to visit uh, has been detained for 3 years, now going on to 3.5. So I think the most horrifying thing for me has always been learning about these personal stories of individuals who are currently detained and also facing deportation proceedings, because I can't imagine, being detained for that long, because those are you're missing birthdays, Christmases, you're housed in diminishing conditions, places where immigration uses solitary confinement as punishment against, laws on arbitrary torture. So I think those conditions, especially sitting in front of people and hearing their stories firsthand, have always, I think, been the saddest parts of my doctoral education. The fact that to be able to document these conditions and document what's going on inside, you have to talk to people and get their personal stories and document that. But it's always come with I think the most heartbreak because you're sitting across the room from someone who could be your aunt, who could be your uncle, and in many cases, I think especially for me, with my own tenuous legal status, in a lot of cases that could also be me. So I think that's been, I think, the most horrifying thing is that uh, the only thing that separates the people outside of detention from those inside is usually just luck, especially as we've come to see immigration enforcement now. Who gets picked up and who doesn't is very arbitrary, right? There's been reports of DACA recipients just like me being picked up at airports, being told that their permits don't really count and they don't really matter, and they still get sent to detention. So I think just those experiences that I've had inside the Northwest Detention Center in Seattle, as well as the Florence Detention Center in Arizona, I think those have really shaped and defined me. But it's essentially, I think, been the most, I don't know, horrifying experience of my doctoral education is that on the ground work with individuals who are detained.
Wow. Honestly, I can't imagine what it's like to sit with that as part of your program. So when you think about what you just shared there, what gives you hope? What gives you hope for the future? What gives you the most hope in what you've in what you've learned?
Yeah, I think I know things seem very bleak right now, right? With everything going on, but I think the thing that gives me the most hope is the ways that people have kind of expanded their visions of organizing. So when I grew up, organizing was really directed towards the state, right? We were organizing for rights, we were organizing for citizenship, but now I've seen people organize for things that are so much more expansive, and they're organizing for futures that I don't think we've been able to imagine yet. So, for example, the call and the organizing call to abolish ICE, right? That's very new. 20 years ago in the movement, you didn't have people very much so calling for the abolishment of ICE or the abolishment of Homeland Security. So I think the thing that gives me the most hope is definitely that organizer abolitionist mindset of, oh, we can ask for more things. We can ask for futures that don't necessarily exist yet. And I think a lot of the hope for me is based on the idea that organizers and individuals just in the immigration space are really utilizing like history and seeing the things that have been possible before and the things that can be possible in the future. Especially the things that have been coming out of Minnesota and the way that people have been able to organize with each other and organize in their own communities, support each other, mutual aid networks, kind of the ways that people have kind of supported each other and protected each other, even when the federal government hasn't done so. I think that's what gives me the most hope, because I've always seen the law as fundamentally restrictive in its design, and what's legal isn't always what's moral. So the way that people have been able to organize outside the confines of the law and be able to expand the vision of justice beyond what the law allows, I think is what's giving me the most hope.
You just gave me hope. Like, truly, thank you. That was beautifully said. Thank you for that. Uh, it's a very profound work that you're doing, working with humans and human rights. Let me ask you, so let's talk about it because sometimes there is confusion around what human rights are. And I want to make sure we talk about that here. What are human rights? Real world case. What are human rights?
And I think that is a very, I think, profound and philosophical question because there's a lot of literature on what human rights are, how they change with cultural contexts. Uh, but I think the answer fundamentally depends on essentially who you're asking, right? I think for me, as someone who's been very involved in migration and migration uh, research, human rights always, for me, includes the right to migrate, right? The right to be able to leave your territory of birth to be able to establish yourself in a new place. I think for me, that's always been involved in universal human rights, right? The rights that we all carry because we're individuals and we're people. And that's kind of the version of human rights that I subscribe to, right? Regardless of your citizenship status, your nationality, your creed, or your origin, you are endowed with certain rights because at the end of the day, you're a human being. And that does not change based on what territory you're on, what language you speak, and what jurisdiction you're a part of. And, not everyone subscribes to that same idea. Human rights have always been contested. But I think the important part is that a lot of people kind of misunderstand that human rights are, while we argue for human rights to be universal, inalienable, they can be abstract. But at the end of the day, there are things that are negotiated. There are things that, quote unquote, the powerless contest with the powerful. It's like a conversation between citizens and individuals on the territory with the state that they reside in. But I think the most important part is that they usually require active, ongoing struggle to exist. And I think throughout history, human rights have never been just granted, right? It's something that the people fight for and the people actively struggle for, whether that be civil rights, economic rights, political rights, and they change over time. So now you could really argue the right to, for example, the right to shelter. Some people argue for that as a universal human right. Some people argue for internet access because internet access is so fundamental to the way we interact with society. That can also be a human right. Uh, so it really depends on who you ask and kind of the school of thought that you subscribe to. But for me, it's always been more so the fact that everyone, because they are a human being, you are endowed with uh, universal human rights, regardless of your citizenship status or any other classification that the state may impose.
It's a good explanation. I think I subscribe to the same school of thought of like you have to because I remember when I went for my human rights certification, we learned like there's like some people believe human rights you just have them. There's a school of thought that says you have to like, argue about them or talk about them to give them. I subscribe to that we all have them regardless of other identities and other things. So yeah, it's interesting how we look at the same thing so differently.
Yeah, and it's over time these things have changed and evolved, and different countries have different explanations. In Latin America, it's a very big thing to where human rights are so much more expansive than what we think about human rights in the United States. Like the right to access to food, the access to water, the access to a healthy environment. Human rights are so culturally dependent to where I think there's a lot of things that we can learn from other parts of the world to the fact that what you think of human rights isn't always necessarily, the things that we think of like through our constitution, like constitutional rights, the right to free speech, the right to an attorney. There's so many more things that can be thought of as human rights to where there's just so many expansive ideas of applications that can be found like just across the world.
I love that. Okay. So I want to build on that too. I love how you describe human rights and we know what they are. Where are human rights being violated in ways that people may not know or don't realize?
Yeah, and I think it really depends on again like how you view human rights. I think more recently I've been very, very focused, on immigration enforcement. And a lot of people don't really realize that right now there's a big thing surrounding non-refoulement, which is essentially the state obligation to not return migrants or individuals to places where they may face torture. So right now, there's a very big trend in the United States to where immigrations and customs enforcement will arrest or redetain or put in deportation proceedings people who have qualified and been given withholding of removal by an immigration judge. So essentially, once an individual is granted withholding of removal, the United States has an obligation to not return that individual back to the country from which they might be tortured. But what immigration is now doing is essentially deporting the individual with a grant of withholding of removal to a third country that they argue is very safe. But for a lot of these people, especially given reports from the United Nations and the IACHR, that's resulting in what's called chain refoulement, which is basically you're not sending the individual back to the country where they may face persecution and torture, but because you're sending them to a country with no formal ties, where they may not speak the language, where they have no family or no community relationships, that can also result in the danger to the individual's life. So there's a very big argument right now that the United States is engaged in what's called crimes against humanity, which are these big international legal crimes such as torture, such as genocide, because essentially you have a big population in the United States that's being deported regardless of their active grants of immigration benefits, and they're still facing these circumstances of torture, of persecution, regardless of where they're being sent. Because I've had people from Guatemala, from Mexico deported to Africa, to Djibouti, to places where they have no fundamental ties, which make absolutely no sense, besides the idea that the government is trying to impose criminality or trying to impose a sense of deterrence for future migration. So that's one of the spaces where I've seen human rights being violated so horrifyingly that you would never think that it's happening in your own backyard. But across the immigration space, I think fundamentally the whole immigration structure, I think, is essentially unfortunately, one big human rights violation. We don't really think of the law as allowing for fundamental human rights violations, but the way that the immigration space has been carved out, especially in the United States, is one of inherent, human rights violations because most of it is under the control of the executive. So both the immigration courts, ICE, the whole Department of Justice is under executive control. So you really have a space where most of the governance structures are fundamentally impacted by political will, by executive political will. And I think that really leads to a lot of the things that we're seeing today with just unchecked executive power and immigration kind of doing whatever they really want with the immigrants in their custody. So that's, I think, another space where there is a bigger, profound conversation to be had on the structure of immigration in the United States and kind of how it enables these mass violations of human rights that I think a lot of the American public doesn't know that is kind of occurring in their own backyard.
That's that's powerful for me. Like, especially when you said, you know, because it is interesting. Like, people are being sent to third countries, countries that they're not from, nor were they in. And so, like, that's what, like, why? But then also, you said genocide earlier, and I'm just like, I guess just dawning because it's obvious to me there's a very specific group of people being targeted because I'm first generation American. I'm a child of immigrants, and nobody in my community has bat an eyelash about immigration. No one has. I'm Albanian. No one hit. No one's scared. No one says anything. It's just a very specific group of people that are being targeted. And just when you said genocide, it just like made me think of like, oh, that because there's several stages of genocide, and that this is what's happening to especially brown people, Hispanic, Latino, Latinx. It's going through all the 10 steps.
The fundamental stages. And I think one of the most horrifying things is that these architectures of immigration don't just stop at undocumented people. We've seen these things kind of begin to expand outwards. So they're not just targeting people without immigration status anymore. For maybe 10 years, individuals in my situation were considered quote unquote safe, but very recently, people with deferred action status, people with valid work permits, people with permanent residency, and even people who have naturalized have kind of become subjects of this grander deportation machine, right? So people who should, under statutory law, have no reason to be detained or even being subject to deportation proceedings are being placed in deportation proceedings. I think the larger apparatus of migration governance in the United States is not anymore not only targeting undocumented people, you kind of start seeing these ripple effects to where it begins encompassing more people and more people and more people. And I think in the literatures that I study and in my field, there's a very big conversation to be had about how a country will illegalize large portions of the population. So, for example, Venezuelans have been a very largely contested group in the United States, especially with temporary protected status. But when the courts decide to take temporary protected status away, that essentially converts people who had work permits, people who had a deferral of deportation, that converts them into being undocumented. So the country actively is making people convert into undocumented status who are then subject to deportation proceedings. And that's, a population of 800,000 people. So you have thousands and thousands of people in the United States who are actively losing their immigration status and then fundamentally being funneled into these larger structures of deportation proceedings, into detention structures. So these ripple effects of who is subject to the immigration apparatus and who is not is fundamentally contested because these things change over time. And over the last year, we've seen more and more people fundamentally be stripped of both their immigration status, but also of the idea that they belong, right? Because there's been talks of denaturalization campaigns, there's been talks of fraudulent citizenship applications, just trying to apply that immigration structure to more and more people. And I think, to me, that's the most horrifying part, right? Because who is affected by immigration is now not only like my community, not just undocumented people, but even citizens now. The killing of Renee Good, of Alex Peretti, these individuals were U.S. citizens who had no reason to draw the subject of immigration's ire, but at the end of the day, it resulted in the cost of their life just because they were reporting or just because they were in proximity to immigration enforcement. So I think the most horrifying thing for me has just been watching immigration kind of expand who it targets and who it affects, to where we even now have people on the congressional floor testifying that, oh, the state attempted to execute me, but I'm a US citizen. And now I'm drawing their ire because they were unable to execute me. And in the legal literature, this is called extrajudicial killings because the killings of Renee Good and Alex Preddy were not sanctioned, or there's no legal structure around their killing besides uh, federal immigration officers just decided in the moment to enact their death. So I think not only do I think more people should be worried and maybe a little afraid of the democratic backsliding in the United States, but fundamentally, I think this all comes down to the conversation of these expanding, executive powers and immigration, and kind of how their reach is expanding just more beyond us, but to encompass more and more people who, in the political structure, are being contested to belong versus who's not allowed to belong.
We're going to talk more about like Alex Preddy, Renee Good, folks that have been unalived because of ICE. But based on what you shared, we have an idea of the what. What are your thoughts on like why do these violations persist even in a democracy like ours, in a country like ours? Why is it still persisting?
Yeah, and I think that is also a larger conversation. We do fundamentally live in a constitutional, republic with active democratic norms. Uh, but I think fundamentally, democracy is just the way that they're structured. They enshrine their rights in things like constitutions, in the Bill of Rights, and statutes and legislation. Uh, but I think fundamentally, the implementation of those rights really depends on political will, capacity, and kind of who the United States or other democracies that can be applied anywhere else uh, who they consider what's called quote unquote a rights bearing subject, which is essentially like who is allowed to have rights in the jurisdiction versus who is not. And I think that conversation of who is allowed rights in a democracy versus who is not is always fundamentally being contested, right? And it's something that changes over time. For a very long time in the immigration space, the only individuals who could naturalize, become citizens, were individuals who were white. But the category of who's white has also changed over time, right? Originally, Italians or Irish were not considered white, so they were not considered rights-bearing subjects. For a long time, Chinese migration was fundamentally excluded. So who was allowed to belong in the democracy, who was allowed to belong in the polity, has always kind of fundamentally changed over time. But I think the big place where, especially today, these things come up again is in the immigration space, in the immigration domain. Because I think fundamentally in the immigration space, constitutional constraints are the weakest. It's the point where the law has the weakest application of constitutional law. I think of all domains of domestic U.S. law, and usually within U.S. immigration law, they've historically permitted government actions that would otherwise be unconstitutional in other contexts. So a lot of individuals in my field and the things that I study call these zones of exception, right? Which is essentially exceptional zones in the law within democratic states that allow, the state to engage in actions that would otherwise be unconstitutional using justifications that kind of circumvent traditional constitutional law. And usually within immigration, you see this a lot within detention, right? Because the way that individuals are detained in detention, the arbitrariness, the fact that it's very prolonged, individuals can be detained for years. Right now, the ability to ask for bond is heavily restricted and it's been diminished over time. So these things that you kind of see in the immigration space, in the criminal context, in the penal code, these things would be seen as unconstitutional, right? But just because it's being applied to the immigration sector within immigration law, they're not deemed unconstitutional. They're actually very much permitted under U.S. immigration law. So the and this goes for any democratic country, right? It's not just the United States that engages in these behaviors in one area of law while spouting democracy in the other. The EU does this all the time. Australia, with its externalized border controls, they send individuals, instead of holding them on the territory, they send them to other places to be housed somewhere else. But essentially, there's big areas of law where the application of constitutional law is very uneven and ill-applied. And I think in the United States, immigration law is that space where the constitutional protections active on the territory are not very well translated.
Okay, that's really insightful. Oh, it made me think of some other things that I think we should talk about. Based on what you just even shared there, can you talk to me a little bit about like what are the themes that have been emerging that you have noticed and seen with immigration? Talk to us about like numbers, what's going on.
Yeah, and I think the immigration space, I think fundamentally right now is very, very different than in the previous administration, right? I think we're seeing record detention numbers, and for the first time, I believe the detention population has exceeded 70,000 individuals. And this is the point in history, right, where ICE is actually responsible for the large majority of detentions versus CBP, and CBP is Customs and Border Protection. Uh, and essentially what that means is there's less apprehensions at the border versus in the domestic territory, right? So the immigration apparatus has fundamentally changed who it's targeting. So you don't really see apprehensions at the border anymore. And this is for a variety of reasons, right? It can be migration flows. It can be the fact that asylum has very much so been gutted at the border, regardless of international domestic law. But essentially, it just really means that the administration has so largely focused on apprehending people inside of the territory that now CBP isn't as responsible for the number of detentions as ICE. So I think right now we have 70,766 individuals detained across the United States. representing really a historic high. And fundamentally, this has overwhelmed, I think, the current detention structure. So you have a lot of detention centers kind of exceeding their contractual capacity by hundreds of people, and this has resulted in instances of housing individuals in places that aren't designed for human confinement. So there were reports in Los Angeles of being people being housed or confined in basement rooms of federal buildings. Um, and you really see and you really see kind of the violations that come from the fact that not everyone is being housed in detention centers. I think the large number of apprehensions have really resulted in just people being housed in random locations and in random places, which in some places have amounted to disappearances. There was a case in Washington State where a family was just housed at one of the federal offices, and essentially they were not showing up on the ICE detainee locator. They weren't showing up in immigration records. So their attorneys and their family members had no idea where these people were. And it took universities and it took advocates to be able to find this family and kind of argue for their release, because essentially they disappeared from the federal location system. And you also have the profile of individuals who are detained actively changing in real time. I think the percentage of individuals with no criminal record who are currently detained is now at 74.2%. So the large majority of individuals who are currently detained in the United States have no criminal record, besides, their undocumented presence. So I think there's a very big argument in the immigration narrative that, and we've seen this from the second Trump administration, to where he's saying, these people are criminals, these people are bad for the government, for the economy, just these hateful narratives that have no basis in real life data. These are just inflammatory political commentaries, because the data really shows that the people who are being detained have actively no criminal record. And the justification for the detention is literally just because individuals are undocumented or lacking legal status. And this has really resulted in, I think, around a 2,000% increase in the number of people with no criminal record being held in ICE custody. Uh, and aside from that, there's also been, uh, because of the One Big Beautiful Bill and all this money being funneled towards immigration, uh, there's been a proliferation of, for-profit detention mechanisms. So a lot of people in the United States don't know, but the people who detain and incarcerate immigrants, it isn't the United States government. The United States government has regulated or relegated that authority, that sovereign power to detain individuals and detain bodies to private corporations. And in the United
Oh, I didn't
States,
know that.
uh, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
I didn't know that. They like kind of outsource, delegate to corporations.
These are for-profit corporations. So fundamentally, these individuals have a profit incentive to keep you detained, to keep you locked up. And if you hop onto these individuals' earnings calls, their shareholder meetings, fundamentally, these people want more incarceration. They want more bodies detained, because at the end of the day, that's their money incentive. That's the way that they make profit. And that's not even speaking to the conditions of detention, of confinement, right? There was a very big lawsuit in Washington State over the $1 a day policy, which is essentially these private prisons companies were uh, were outsourcing their labor to the detained individuals and paying them $1 a day for 8, 10, 12 hours of work. So essentially, you also have these private prison corporations essentially running forced labor inside of detention. And within these same court cases, you see instances of these private corporations using solitary confinement as punishment for refusing to work, or using retaliation and taking away phone access or taking away access to the outside contact with the outside world because they did not want to engage in that program. Uh, so fundamentally, I think these instances of being housed by private corporations is also a massive fundamental human rights violation, because how do you hold a private corporation accountable to human rights law? It's been a very difficult thing to do, because these private corporations sometimes say, "Oh, we're a private corporation, so we're not bound to due process, or we're not bound to these constitutional restraints." But in other court cases, in other arguments, you really see these private corporations say, "No, we have sovereign immunity because we're federal contractors." So these people are existing in the legal gray area to where they can kind of do and say whatever they want without a lot of legal consequence.
You need to come back for another episode so we can talk about capitalism and, and the role of capitalism in this. Because I did not know that. I didn't know these were for-profit private entities that were involved, but also contributed to the. Because I've been seeing all kinds of different articles and posts about the conditions that the folks are in these overcrowded areas, the water being dirty. Even I was reading earlier about the 2-month-old baby that was in the detention center, and the child's mom had to use like dirty water to make formula for the baby. And it's just like, but now to think that there are corporations behind that, it just,
Yeah, and it's terrifying. I think for-profit incarceration in general, right, is terrifying because once you regulate that sovereign power to detain people to private corporations, their incentive is now just to make money, and the way that they make money is by holding you in prison, which I think
it's
is
like slavery.
fundamentally it's terrifying. And I think the ways that I've seen it play out in person is just the fact that they have contractual obligations with the federal government, but there's no enforcement mechanism, right? So when we catch these private corporations engaging in violations of their own contract with immigration, uh, there's no way to enforce that, and there's no way to hold these people accountable because at the end of the day, these are private corporations who sometimes claim sovereign immunity or federal immunity versus sometimes they don't. And that's been one of the big problems with tackling these human rights violations is just the model of incarceration in the United States for immigrants is a for-profit model, which is essentially just allowing for these rampant abuses of both personal liberties and fundamental rights. I think one of the more horrifying aspects of what I've seen in detention is individuals with mental health impairment being punished with solitary confinement, not being given the medication that they need, individuals spending more than 2 weeks in solitary, just rampant abuses by a private corporation with government authority. Uh, and I think if there's anything that I say today that kind of gets out there is that these are private businesses running their profit on the incarceration of our community members.
I'm going to quote you on that because that's powerful. That I haven't heard a single person talk about that. Like it's not come up in any space, in any
Really.
conversation. It's everything's DHS, ICE, government, and no one's talking about the private companies that are making money off of this.
I
So
think
we're talking about it.
in yeah, and I think in the next year it's going to become a way bigger conversation because we see 70,000 people detained right now. But under the Lake and Riley Act of 2025 and under these massive transfer of funds to immigrations and customs enforcement, they're not stopping at 70,000 individuals detained. The money being funneled into immigration. I think one of the analysis by the American Immigration Council was that they could have 135,000 beds operational by the end of the year. And that's a massive transfer of community members into for-profit systems of incarceration. And even talking about these mass removal campaigns and the money going into immigration, the budget for detention and the budget for immigration is now nearly twice that of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. So imagine the fact that Immigrations and Customs Enforcement is now the not only the largest policing entity in the United States, but is also the largest entity that incarcerates human bodies in the United States. So these massive transfers of both money and authority are really fueling just immigration as the largest policer and the largest incarcerator.
So thank you for educating on this because this is really powerful stuff. So I have a question because you brought up Lake and Riley Act. So talk to me a little bit about because one of the things that I hear a lot when it comes to immigration, when people talk about immigration, they say they're for ICE because of what happened to Lake and Riley and to others. So I want to hear your thoughts on that, and then there's another part that I want to follow up with. Well, it's just like the Lincoln Riley Act and using people like her and what happened to her, that tragic, she was unalive. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, and I think fundamentally, at the end of the day, I think that story was weaponized for political will, and I'm I think at the end of the day, I what happened was tragic. Like the loss of a life is always tragic, uh, but I think the passage of the legislation and the narrative surrounding it is very much so divorced from reality. There's statistical studies done that undocumented people commit less crimes than U.S. citizens. Uh, a large majority of the drug trafficking in the United States is done by U.S. citizens. I think two-thirds, 66%. It's not these crimes normally aren't committed to the same degree by undocumented people as U.S. citizens are. So I think at the end of the day, Laken Riley and its justification was a fallacy, and I think it was a fallacy based on harmful rhetoric and inflammatory rhetoric versus actual, statistical data or research, which I think goes for a lot of immigration policy at the end of the day. Um, but I think people saw Laken Riley as an opportunity to further restrict the freedoms and the liberties for undocumented people, because one of the effects that Laken Riley had was the fact that Immigration and Customs Enforcement can now arrest and detain undocumented individuals who are charged with a crime. And when I say charged with a crime, I don't mean committed, or I don't mean a judge physically said, "Oh, you are guilty." I'm saying charged. So the fact that you are
Oh, just
accused of a crime,
like arrested and charged. Like we're gonna pick
the
you
fact
up for this, and that's enough.
Yes. So the fact that you are accused of a crime now mandates mandatory detention without bond. And I think that's the fundamental terrifying thing about it, is that this is one of the laws that really stripped due process and stripped fundamental constitutional liberties from one group in the territory. And I think there's a lot of studies uh, that are done that, these constitutional restrictions on one group, it doesn't just stop at that one group. Once it's active for one portion of the population, these things have expanding consequences, right? Because a threat to the constitutional liberties of one group in the territory, fundamentally, at the end of the day, history has taught us that these will be repercussions and constitutional violations for a much larger portion of the population. So Laken Riley, at the end of the day, really represented just more stripping of constitutional protections from one group, uh, really based on just harmful and inflammatory rhetoric.
You know, I remember so a couple of things that I wanted to share with that. I remember, so I did an episode of my podcast not too long ago about authoritarianism and how authoritarianism creeps into society. And it's these little things that we do toward marginalize the smaller community, the small community. So what we do to one, we do to another. And so eventually it goes to the other one. And hearing about this it made me just think about like, this is now people are losing their rights because of this fallacy, because of this misinformation and disinformation about immigrants. Because I also read, I think it was the same, it was, I'll have to find it. If they said from like 1980 to like early 2000s, while immigration has gone up, it doubled. Crime has gone down. So that kind of debunks this whole immigrants are violent criminals. They're not actually. The more that came, the more that number went down. So I just thought that was interesting. But this is a form of dehumanization and vilification of a group of people that are different. But from a human rights perspective, have rights here.
Yeah, and I think the conversation around criminality, right? I think criminality at the end of the day is something that can be fabricated, because you see this with the history of immigration policy and immigration law, to where before 1922, uh, re-entry after a deportation was not a crime, but the United States Congress got together and criminalized uh, re-entry of like undocumented people after a deportation order. These are called 1325 and 1376 charges. And a lot of people don't know that these are actually the most highly federally prosecuted crimes in the United States, far outpacing uh, guns and drugs and other forms of federal prosecutions. They constitute the most federally prosecuted uh, crime in the United States, and these are entirely fabricated, right? If you look at the 1922 uh, it's called the 1922 Undesirable Aliens Act, and I hate using that nomenclature, but that's the nomenclature that is assigned to the act, right? Um, these things were heavily criminalized for very specific economic reasons, right? Western agriculture needed cheap labor, but the United States Congress at the time was very against Mexican migration. So what you have is kind of a confluence of criminality to where now the United States has actively decided to criminalize re-entry of undocumented people where that crime didn't exist anymore. And this happens again and again in immigration law, so substantially to where new crimes are being created and then people assign criminality to these individuals, regardless of, how it used to be 10, 20, 30 years ago. And I can give you an example. There's this category of crimes called aggravated felonies that don't exist for US citizens, but exist for individuals without immigration status, that can result in expedited removal, but also like deportation, right? So shoplifting, larceny, like things that could be a misdemeanor under federal law and a small offense in state criminal courts are now these big felony offenses for undocumented people. And these are called aggravated aggravated offenses because the immigration law has structured a parallel to the criminal law, right? And at the end of the day, I think even regardless of the fact that 74.2% of people in immigration detention are do not have a criminal record, I think at the end of the day, the United States has done a very good job of fabricating criminality and assigning new ways to impose criminality on people to where while I find the discussion on criminality very eye-opening and important, I also think it's important to talk about the ways in which the country has increased crimes and increased criminality on specific populations, because regardless of the way that anyone has whatever broken any crime, I think what's constituted a crime has so fundamentally changed throughout the last 10, 20 years, to where I think the discussion should be focused on how does the law create crime and how does the law funnel people into incarceration for crimes that essentially I think the state has fabricated.
So much to unpack with that one. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's wild. Um, so I do want to, because when you think about like criminality, I remember during Obama's term, he also, we deported people. But what he did was he the ones who actually did crimes were deported, and anybody who was not criminal, he let them stay here so they could have a path towards citizenship. What are your thoughts on that? Like the impact of allowing folks to stay here that don't have a criminal history.
Yeah, and I think what you're referring to is actually called ICE's enforcement priorities. So under the Obama administration and then also under the Biden administration, uh, ICE had specific enforcement priorities to where we're prioritizing the enforcement of immigration law for these categories of individuals. And if you have, more than 10 years of presence in the United States, you're not seen as a enforcement target. Uh, and I think fundamentally, I subscribe to the idea that uh, I don't know, regardless of like citizenship, if you have your community ties here and if you've lived your life here, there's essentially no reason for you to be forced to leave. Um, but that's really changed under the Trump administration to where there's not really enforcement priorities anymore. You see essentially uh, an all-out campaign against anyone who might or might not be undocumented. And this is resulting in collateral arrests, mass arrests of individuals and groups. In Arizona specifically, there was a very big thing where they raided a certain business and they didn't just take the individuals that they were there for, they took most of the individuals that were present, regardless of, DACA or TPS or any other protected statuses, they just took everybody. So this is really resulting in collateral arrests and arrests of massive groups. Uh, but essentially, I really do think that uh, the conversation around criminality and those enforcement priorities is also important right now because it really changes who the targets of enforcement are. At least before, we had more of an idea of who was in danger, of being detained or being targeted. But now it's resulted in more confusion to where uh, I can't really sit here and confidently tell you that there's one group of individuals versus another group who are more likely to be detained than others. And the protective factors that we used to see under previous administrations also don't really exist in the same way anymore because regardless of whatever protective factors you have in your case, uh, we're seeing people be detained across all spectrums. So this really changes the profile of who is being detained and who is being subject to enforcement priorities. I'm not sure if that answers the question, actually.
Yeah, yeah, no, totally, totally. And I a couple other things I want to go over and cover, and then I want to move into constitutional rights because there's a lot of confusion about who has what rights. So there's a couple of things I want to kind of do a little bit of like some myth busting, like myth versus fact, because I hear a lot of the same thing, and I wanted to pick your brain on them. So, a couple arguments against undocumented immigrants. One is that they're getting free healthcare. What are your myth or fact?
Is- that is a myth. Even I, as a person, have never received free healthcare. uh, I think that is an argument that's based on an incorrect interpretation of the law that says all individuals in the territory are entitled to like emergency care, right? If you show up at an emergency department at a hospital and you need life-saving care, the hospital cannot turn you away based on immigration status. And that's just fundamentally like across the territory, regardless of who you are, you're able to show up to the emergency room and say, I need life-saving care. But that does not constitute healthcare, right? That is more so a protective mechanism of like emergency care. Uh, while people are allowed that, what you think is healthcare is not, given, unfortunately, to anyone in this country for free, regardless of citizenship status or not. There is no fundamental United States right to healthcare in the United States, regardless of if you're a citizen or not.
Okay, okay, because that's something that comes up all the time. But also related to that, undocumented immigrants pay taxes that pay into the system of healthcare. True or false? Is that a myth or fact?
That one is true. And I think I do have the exact number. I think it averaged 92 billion in 2022. Uh, but essentially, like individuals do pay taxes, and they contribute to these larger systems, and there's specific reasons for that. While uh, the actual act of working, unfortunately, is criminalized, the United States left open a loophole to where the IRS allows for taxes to be paid by people without social security numbers, and this is called the ITIN number, the individual tax identification number. So even within the law of the country, like it's expected that people still pay their taxes. So that myth of people are taking benefits and they're not paying into them, that's also fundamentally not true. I think uh, undocumented people probably pay more in taxes than the richest people in the United States. So I think that's fundamentally not true.
I've always found it interesting that the way our country is set up, that we can have people who work here without social security numbers still pay taxes, but there's consequences for being here if you don't have it.
Yeah, I think fundamentally that's part of like institutional design. It makes no sense that in the tax code there's an ability of undocumented people to pay taxes, but that labor and their presence is criminalized. I think it's like a contradiction. It makes not a lot of sense, right?
Yeah, I've never understood it. Like either it's okay or it's not. But you can't have to walk this fine line of make money off of this group, and then also the minute someone wants to spread misinformation, let's round up every single person who happens to look the same.
And I think at the end of the day, when you see these kind of contradictions within the state's law, I think at the end of the day, they're things that are done for productive means, right? I think it's very well known that individuals pay into these benefits and don't really receive uh, them back, right? And I think this is really done to kind of enrich. At the end of the day, I hate to say it, but it really enriches the country and the individuals who have those benefits. Because if it makes no sense, when you think about it logically, right? I think at the end of the day, it's being done on purpose, and I think that's been one of the big points of my own like research is to kind of look into those contradictions within immigration law and kind of understand, oh, these contradictions make sense because they're being done on purpose. Like the government does these contradictions for very purposeful means. And in the literature and in the scholarship that I study, even the imposition of being undocumented is also done for a productive reason. And at the end of the day, it really enriches not only the economic structure of the country, but also the private corporations that kind of run the immigration government space.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. One more true myth or fact, because I was going to hear your thoughts. There's a lot of conversation on the Save Act and this accusation of one political party, having undocumented immigrants or non-citizens vote. Can undocumented immigrants vote?
Yeah, that's a myth I've never really understood because no, they cannot. And it's never been true that undocumented people could vote. Voting has always required citizenship status, regardless of any documents required. You've always needed citizenship status to vote in federal elections, and it's never been true that undocumented people are voting in federal elections. I see that as the SAVE Act fundamentally. I've seen arguments that it imposes essentially a poll tax on individuals because I think only one third of US citizens have a US passport. And fundamentally, that's a conversation of income and who's allowed access to these higher level documents versus who's not. Um, so I think the basis of the SAVE Act is really being done. It's blaming undocumented people, but at the end of the day, it's a poll tax on your ability to vote. Uh, and it's being done by scapegoating undocumented people. But at the end of the day, that's going to impact US citizens' ability to exercise their fundamental constitutional rights because these are essentially poll taxes. There's millions of people who their birth certificate has a different last name than their current documentation, especially after marriage. And essentially that makes you ineligible to vote, right? Under the SAVE Act, you need a US passport to vote. That's $130 for individuals who are living below the poverty line. Applying for and receiving a US passport is so economically restrictive to where large portions of the population are going to choose not to do so versus spend the money that they need to spend on food and actual living necessities versus going out to vote now that a US passport is required. So no, that is definitely a myth. I think undocumented people have never had the right to vote in the United States.
Yeah, it's just wild to me that this SAVE Act, in my opinion, is the most worthless act that's ever been passed because it's passing something that nobody's doing. But I think to your point, it's very much a dehumanization, vilifying. Look at this group. We're doing something about this. But the reality is there's no data that shows that anybody that is not a citizen has voted. And I believe the poll tax is like under the 24th Amendment. Where
Yeah,
it's where like,
and
yeah.
I think it just goes again into the conversation of we've seen such a big democratic backslide in the United States to where there's been a ton of nonprofits and a bunch of individuals from different research firms that are showing that fundamentally the United States is sliding kind of into what's called an electoral autocracy to where we still have free elections. But the individuals who are in power are fundamentally engaged in massive aggregations of power. So, in contrast to what's on the books in the Constitution and in our different amendments, you have different instances where politicians are engaging in what's fundamentally undemocratic actions like restricting voting, restricting due process, restricting the ability of individuals to contest their own detentions. So I think this really turns from, I think and going forward in the future, the immigration conversation is fundamentally going to become a conversation about executive overreach, about political power in the United States. and fundamentally what kind of political system we're living under. Because especially at the university level, and these individuals who are thinking bigger about the political system and their connotations, people are sounding alarms about democratic recession and democratic backsliding, and the fact that these aggregations of power are fundamentally threatening to democratic norms in the United States.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. So the next thing I want to get into, because this is the thing I feel like I hear the most about. So I'm excited to hear your perspective. Constitutional rights. I've seen a lot of people say that what happened to Alex Preddy and Renee Good, not constitutional. What a lot of people are saying, if you are not a citizen, the Constitution doesn't apply to you. Can you walk us through what are constitutional rights of citizens and what are constitutional rights of undocumented immigrants?
Yeah, and I think fundamentally there's not really a big difference in between them in terms of constitutional rights, right? Regardless of your immigration status, everyone in the territory has constitutional rights in the United States. So the myth of or the idea that undocumented individuals don't have rights is fundamentally false. And this is really based on Supreme Court precedent, right? There was a Supreme Court case, I think, in 1886. I think it was Yip Woo v. Hopkins, where the Supreme Court said that constitutional protections are quote unquote universal in their application to all persons within the territorial jurisdiction. So that phrase, right, all persons it's what's extremely important because all persons does not denote citizens versus non-citizens. It says all persons. So everyone in the jurisdiction of the United States, physical presence constitutes all persons, right? So that discussion of undocumented people don't have constitutional rights versus citizens have all the constitutional rights. That's fundamentally untrue because Supreme Court precedent has really said that it really doesn't matter if you're a citizen versus you're a non-citizen. Everyone in the United States has constitutional rights regardless of their citizenship status. There was another Supreme Court case, I think it was and I'm going to butcher the name, but it was Sadvidas v. Davis, which was in 2001, where again the Supreme Court was saying that the due process clause in specific applies to all persons in the United States, whether their presence is lawful, unlawful, temporary, or permanent. So the Supreme Court has consistently stated throughout the last 150, 180 years that constitutional rights are not contingent upon immigration status. So both citizens and non-citizens of the territory have constitutional rights. So the really key principle here is the idea of territorial jurisdiction, right? Which essentially just means when someone is physically present in the United States, uh, regardless of their citizenship status, right, or how they entered, they're subject to the United States, so they receive constitutional rights. Uh, and I think that's the very important clause that people don't always fundamentally get right. It really doesn't depend on citizenship status. It depends on the fact that you're in the territory means that you receive your constitutional rights at the end of the day. So when you think of the right to free speech, um, non-citizens have the fundamentally the right to free speech, the First Amendment, the right to due process, the Fifth and 14th Amendments, and the Fourth Amendment against unreasonable search and seizure. These are things that are not bound by citizenship status. Individuals, regardless of citizenship status, have a constitutional right to engage in free speech, to uh, be allowed or to have the right against unreasonable search and seizure. These things are not bound by citizenship status. So at the end of the day, regardless if you have citizenship or not, there are fundamental constitutional rights that you and I will always have access to because we live in the United States.
You know, thank you for just that for sharing that because you know what, even when you read some of these amendments, the words that they used when they wrote them are very specific. Sometimes they say person, people, sometimes they say citizen. So they're when you read it, it's very clear. And I also, and correct me if I'm wrong, I remember also learning when the 13th Amendment was passed, it did not give citizenship to Black people who had been freed from slavery. And so the wording in the amendments because the way they're so general, because not everybody was a citizen at the time. But then the 14th Amendment fixed that. But there was, so that's just something I learned not too long ago. So I thought it was interesting.
Yeah, and I think the wording, I think at the heart of, the the legal profession, I think wording is always extremely important, and its subtleties in wording and the interpretation of the wording really delineate the way that laws are implemented. But at the end of the day, I think these constitutional principles, the fact that it says all persons, I think that's the key principle, right? All persons. It doesn't say all U.S. citizens, and even the way that you and I think about citizenship status today, the framers of the Constitution didn't have the same idea of U.S. citizenship as you and I do today. U.S.
Oh, that's a great
citizenship is,
point.
yeah, it's U.S. citizenship, like the idea of citizenship itself, the idea of passports, the idea even of borders, fundamentally the way they exist today, people 200 years ago are not going to recognize these principles because they're just such new modern concepts.
And I never thought about that before. How we look at citizenship today is vastly different from our forefathers, our founding fathers.
Yeah, and I mean, even back then, like the idea of dual citizenship, dual nationality, like when you think of dual nationality, maybe like 400 years ago, people would have thought you can't have two allegiances to two different countries. That makes no sense. But today, thousands, millions of people have dual nationalities, triple nationalities. Uh, so these principles change over time, and they're really subject to the specific society and where society is at that specific point in time. So these things constantly evolve, these ideas constantly evolve. And I think that's the reason why constitutional amendments are allowed because uh, the world is going to continue fundamentally changing. And the amendments are one of the ways in which uh, constitutional law is meant to be like updated and actualized into modern society, even if we haven't had a constitutional amendment in a very long time.
Okay, so to kind of put that all together, everyone, the First Amendment are right. The First Amendment applies to everyone. The Fifth Amendment, everyone. Fourth Amendment, everyone. 14th Amendment, everyone. Okay, so due process, search, preventing search and seizures, things like that. So we know we have these constitutional rights. I want to talk about ICE and our constitutional rights. Now, for this part, I do want to preface this is educational only. This is not legal advice. If you have questions about anything immigration and law, please talk to an immigration lawyer. Uh, this is not legal advice, but we are going to talk about what is ICE? What is the authority of ICE in this country? What's their authority? Like, what can they do? What can't they do?
Yeah, and I think there's a larger fundamental discussion because I think more recently we've seen immigration and enforcement engage in things that are beyond their constitutional limitations, right? There's been a narrative that's come out that people aren't allowed to record immigration while they're conducting enforcement. Fundamentally, that's not true, right? It's within your constitutional rights to record these policing actions. So when immigration agents tell you that that is not within your rights, that's fundamentally untrue. As long as you don't, an individual doesn't engage in preventing like these specific enforcement actions, or they get in the middle of it, you're fundamentally allowed to record. Um, so there's been a very big narrative around what you can and can't do in terms of immigration. And I think one of the biggest ones is the idea that the idea of observing the federal government's actions and protesting against it. Um, that's the First Amendment, right? Individuals are allowed to protest against these government actions. They're also allowed to observe them and record them, and it should protect you against government retaliation for these acts. So when we're talking about the unaliving of U.S. citizens because they were present, because they were recording, um, that is fundamentally against like their constitutional rights, right? So that's one of the ways in which immigration has kind of started transcending the boundaries of their constitutional limitations because it's fundamentally untrue that you cannot record them. absolutely can, and you absolutely should. And it's one of the ways that people are able to protect themselves against unconstitutional stops and unconstitutional searches is the fact that people are around to document it, to record it, and then to denounce it. And fundamentally, in the future, when there's a different regime or a different government in power, it's going to be one of the most important ways that we have to hold these people accountable, because if you have video evidence, it's very hard to refute, right? So it's absolutely within your power to record these government acts. When we think about the Fifth and 14th Amendments, the right to due process, um, that's the idea that and the government has to justify their actions when they're taking these specific actions of enforcement, and that applies within the immigration context too. Um, you also have the right to against unreasonable search and seizure. Uh, People need probable cause, and immigration especially needs warrants, right, to enter private property. And one of the big discussions I want to have here too is the idea of the public and the private space, because fundamentally individuals have more protection on private property than they do on public property, right? Because if you're in the public space, immigration can just come up to you. They don't need a warrant. You don't have the same protections as you do in private property. So in private property, fundamentally, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement needs a judicially assigned warrant to be able to enter either your home or your business. It has to be your full spelling of your name, your legal name. Uh, and one of the things that immigration has done over the last 20 years is issue their own kind of administrative warrants. So essentially, it's under the Department of Justice. You'll see a Department of Justice warrant saying, "We have a warrant for the arrest of this individual," and immigration will try to use that administrative warrant to enter homes or to enter private businesses. Uh, but that's one of the points of education that I want to have here too, is that those administrative warrants do not constitute judicial warrants. They're not signed by a federal judge. Uh, so if immigration attempts to use administrative warrants to gain entrance into your private property, whether it be a business or your home, you have no obligation to let them in. It has to be a signed judicial warrant uh, to be able to constitute entry into your home or into your private property. And this is something that individuals in different spaces can exercise, right? It can be exercised at businesses. I've seen it done at gyms, at restaurants. People saying, no, ICE cannot come here because it is private property. And unless you have a judicial warrant, you are not allowed inside. Uh, but again, not everyone knows the difference between an administrative warrant and a judicial warrant, because sometimes with these government documents, they kind of either look the same or they use big words that not many of us understand. But at the end of the day, a judicial warrant is fundamentally different from an administrative warrant. And that's one of the points of education that I think are very important, especially right now, to where ICE is attempting to use whatever mechanisms they can to carry out these large arrests and large enforcement actions, is the idea that they can use administrative warrants to enter private property, but that's not the case. At the end of the day, it's not within their constitutional authority to do so. Only a federal judge, the judiciary, can sign a warrant for your apprehension. So that does not constitute their ability to enter private property. Uh, in terms of, I think there's also been a very big discussion on what constitutes probable cause of being undocumented in the United States, right? And more recently, I think last year there was a Supreme Court decision, I think, that really altered probable cause in the United States to where you can uh, use racial profiling as yeah, and I think that's been one of the most devastating things because it really opens racial profiling, and the idea of who's undocumented versus who's not undocumented in the United States is very based on, these ideas that individuals in the national ethos have about what undocumented people look like. So essentially, you have kind of a regime that has been empowered by the Supreme Court to utilize racial profiling in these immigration stops. So unfortunately, um, the application of your constitutional rights, it's part of that larger conversation of democratic backsliding because uh, essentially greenlighting racial profiling really is going to lead to a lot of arbitrary arrests, both of citizens and non-citizens alike. And it really depends on that conversation of who immigration thinks is undocumented versus who they don't think is undocumented. Like if you look at me, and for the individuals who cannot see me right now, I am very light skinned, right? And I have light hair. I don't believe I speak English with a very heavy accent. So under enforcement operations, it might not specifically target me because under that probable cause segment that the Supreme Court allowed, I might not look what an immigration agent thinks an undocumented person look like, regardless of my actual status. So my appearance, kind of my racial street appearance, is a protective factor because I'm not necessarily the people that they're technically, or the people that we know that they're out looking for. They're using language, they're using accents, they're using physical appearance to constitute what they think an undocumented person looks like. And at the end of the day, that's going to have repercussions across the whole democratic system because uh, U.S. citizens and individuals who live here, the United States is fundamentally a multi-ethnic society, right? Um, so who the government thinks is undocumented versus who they don't think is undocumented at the end of the day is goes into the question of who is American versus who's not, who's allowed to belong, who is not allowed to belong. And that is a larger conversation I think that needs to be had because what these constitutional principles and what these decisions are enshrining is that people who look a certain way are fundamentally being told, oh, you are not American, you do not belong. And uh, I think we really need to talk about those ideas of who is allowed to belong, who's not allowed to belong, and how law and case decisions and case law, as well as these enforcement priorities, kind of are restructuring who's allowed and who's not allowed to belong in the national fabric. I know that kind of went a little away from constitutional principles, but
No, but there's some good points there because a couple things I'm gonna kind of work backwards. And you may already know that. I'm sure you know this, but like it's estimated around I think in the next by 2040 or 2050, like the demographic of this country is going to change drastically, and whites will no longer be the majority. And I just saw recently was posted that for the first time, and it's weird phrasing, but for the first time, with babies being born, the majority of them were not white babies. And so when I hear this push to target brown people, and the same time people are upset that they're becoming the minority, it's almost like you can almost draw the lines of like, I think I know why. Why? It's not about who, it's just about preserving whatever people call white culture.
yeah, and I think immigration law has always kind of struggled, I think, with that question. When you read congressional debates in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, where they're debating immigration law and its implementation, a lot of it really is based on uh, unfortunately, racial hierarchies, eugenics, these ideas of who belongs in the national structure versus who's not allowed to belong. That conversation you and I were having earlier about 1325 and 1326 charges, those were passed because of racial animus, right? Congress didn't want Mexican migration because, quote unquote, it was contaminating the racial purity of the nation. So when we think about racism as being something from like the pre-civil rights era, something that was eradicated after civil rights. It will never be true because fundamentally these legislations, these laws that are still active were passed because of racial animus, and these are codified into the U.S. code, into U.S. law. And as long as these racially motivated laws are on the books, it essentially racism will always perpetuate because it's still within our legal structure. Law is not neutral on face value. It can be read as neutral, but it is never neutral in its application. And I think that's the very important point is that when a law is passed because of racial animus, it will never be neutral in its application. And that's what we see with immigration law today. That's what we see with policing in the United States, regardless of immigration status. I think for me, one of the biggest points in my own development was learning about Black Lives Matter and the idea that for a lot of communities in the United States, citizenship isn't the ultimate protective factor, right? Like you still have individuals contesting belonging regardless of citizenship status. So for me, like the struggles of the Black community and their struggle for rights, it really animates the idea of we're all so interconnected because um, our protections don't really constitute because of citizenship status, right? Like you have these whole populations of people in the United States who are having their rights actively contested, their belonging contested, regardless of their citizenship. So for me, that really became a point of like political and like personal development to the idea that uh, there has to be a larger conversation about the laws that are currently active, the racial motivations behind the laws, and what we can do together, transcending different communities, right, to protect each other and to protect uh, what we believe are, universal human rights that might not be enshrined in the laws that are currently active.
Yeah, that's a really great point. You can, like, even go back to earlier when we talked about like when they go after one group, they go after another group. And the Black community, African American community, LGBTQ plus community, women. I mean, there's just so many communities that, regardless of citizenship, their rights are not off the table for repeal or revisit. I mean, LGBTQ people always, thinking about every president. What's it going to be this year? What's going to be this term?
Uh,
But some people, but we live here. Like I'm a, I'm a citizen. So it's. I like what you said. We have to work. It has to be a together thing.
yeah, and I think at the end of the day, we in some way, shape, or form, because we live in this government structure as marginalized people. We have an inherent, I think, duty to each other and an inherent uh, I don't know, an inherent connection to each other to where one attack on one of us will fundamentally turn into an attack on the other. One individual's justice being put in peril is a peril to all of us. So, like when you see people dying in detention, I think people need to realize that usually and historically, it does not always stop at the population that that law or the specific era is targeting, it always expands outward and it always impacts all of us. Even when you think about, I feel like every couple of years, especially as a gay man, like we start thinking about the right to marriage, right? Being contested, being revisited. Um, so I think there's always conversations about the parallels in which our different communities find ourselves in, and overall, just the struggle for rights because uh, the universal struggle for rights is a struggle and it's ongoing and it has to be fought in every generation or else we see what we see today where overall you just have such a big backsliding in rights to where we're turning back the dial, turning back time to a point where a lot of our communities were in active danger and in much more danger than they are right now. So as marginalized people, we have to be very careful of what we allow to happen to one another.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that takes us to what do you think? What do you want people to know? So as we near the end of this episode, what are some things you really feel like are most important for everyone to know about immigration, ICE, protecting our communities, protecting each other? What do you think is vital for everyone?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things you can do, right, is as enforcement has gotten so much worse, as we're seeing, these dehumanizing conditions in detention and the way people are being arrested, being taken. I see reports of people's cars just sitting on the street, right, after they've been taken, and their personal properties just on the street, just abandoned, right. We see these horrifying images, right. Um, but I think regardless of what's going on right now and just the terror that it's inspiring and not only me but in everyone else, I think there's also a lot of hope, and I think we have to hold on to that hope because at the end of the day, these are our communities, right? These are our cities, these are our places of belonging, and these are our homes, and as much as the previous generation struggled for their rights and their belonging, I think it's our time to do the same, to struggle and to kind of fight uh, for our ability not only to belong, but for our ability to live in safety and live in peace. And I think if you've asked yourself previously what you would have done at that point in history, I think you can look outside right now and ask yourself what you're doing right now to protect not only yourself but to protect others.
That's great.
And I think the one thing you can do is join up local organizing. Like people are protecting themselves and their communities. I don't think the Trump administration was expecting such a big pushback in Minnesota to the point where uh, they could have been a lot worse. But because people committed to protecting each other, protecting themselves, and doing so within local frameworks, I think that became such a big pushback to where it really demoralized and it also really affected the Trump administration's response within Minnesota. And I think Minnesota is a really important case study because I don't think it's going to stop at Minnesota. I think it might happen again in other places. So we need to take this as a very big lesson on what to do if federal occupation comes to your home and it comes to your backyard. But there's a lot of hope. There's a lot of mechanisms of protection, and there's a lot of ways that people have actively demonstrated uh, ways to protect each other, whether that's through going with each other to immigration courts or accompanying people, helping people with groceries when they can't leave their houses, or even just one of the things that I've seen is the whistle, like alerting other people that dangers nearby, using all your mechanisms of like the internet and communication to your advantage. Um, I think people need to understand that there's a lot of terror, but there's also a lot of hope. And if we let terror kind of win, then you know the undemocratic forces win. And I think at the end of the day, who's in danger is not just me and my community, or even us as like marginalized people. I think the true danger is uh, there's a danger to our home and there's a danger to the place where we've all lived our whole lives. And I think we have to fight for it. Because for me, even as a migrant and a person who migrated when he was a child, like for better or for worse, this is the only home I've known, and this is where my people are. This is where my community is. This is where my friends and my loved ones are, and I will fight for them until my last breath. And that's what home is. This is our home.
You are amazing, my friend. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your wealth of knowledge with us. Thank you for answering these questions. Thank you for clarifying where there was ambiguity. Thank you. This has been really great. So for our friends that are watching this episode, I'm going to post this on my Patreon. It's totally free. I'll put all the main points we talked about. I have some links, information. Also, if you have questions about immigration, comment on it, and I'll make sure that Carlos takes an opportunity, you know, to answer your questions. And then also, he'll be graduating with his PhD pretty soon. So we're going to snap for him on that. Congratulations, my friend.
Thank you. Thank you.
I can tell by the work you're doing now, the impact that you're having. I can't wait to see what you do with your PhD. So,
Thank you so much.
all
I
right, really,
appreciate
thank
it.
you. Thank you. All right. That is the end of our episode. So, friend, thank you for being here, and we will see you in the next episode.
Thank you.